Esther Ballard did not take the pencil the railroad man held out to her, and she did not step back from the depot wall when he nailed the notice to it, and she did not let her eyes drop to the printed line that offered her $90 for the only sound wagon Ford in 11 miles of the Judith. She had 30 days. That was the first number on the paper, set in heavy type above her own name spelled wrong, and it was the number that mattered. Because on the last of those 30 days, the Territorial and Northern Railroad meant to take her creek crossing whether she signed for it or not, and 4 days after that, a note of hand for $400 fell, due at the Stanford Bank, and there was not, in the whole world she could reach, $400 nor 90 either. It was the last week of May, in the year 1887, and the morning was bright and dry and smelled of horse and pine pitch and the coal smoke of the work train sitting on the new siding. The men on the freight dock had stopped their loading to watch. There were 9 or 10 of them, teamsters and graders, and 2 clerks in sleeve garters, and a heavy man named Boone who drove for the company. And they had the easy, waiting look of men who have already decided how a thing will end and are only staying to see it done. When the agent stepped back from the wall and folded his little hammer into his coat, one of them laughed, low, the way a man laughs who wants to be heard laughing and does not want to be blamed for it. The agent's name was Aldous Pryor. He was a soft-handed man in a good Greytown coat, not young and not old, with a way of speaking that never rose and never hurried, as though everything he said had already been decided somewhere quiet, and he was merely reading it to you as a courtesy. He had a leather folder under his arm and a printed map in it, and he had a manner of looking at a person a little to the side of their eyes, as if their face were a document he had already filed. He was not cruel in the way the dockmen were cruel. He was worse than that, though it would take Esther most of the summer to find the whole shape of it, and by then it would be nailed down harder than any notice. "It's a fair figure, Mrs. Ballard," Pryor said. "More than fair, for a crossing. The company doesn't have to offer $1 over the appraisal, you understand, and the appraisal came in at 60. I put it at 90 myself." He said it as a kindness he expected thanked. 30 days to remove your improvements. The line goes where the survey put it, and the survey put it across your Ford. That's not my doing. That's the ground. The ground, Esther said. It was the first thing she had said, and she said it without heat, turning the 2 words over as if to see what was printed on the back of them. My father surveyed that ground for the land office in '71. He taught me the chain when I was tall enough to drag it. The line does not go across my Ford. Pryor smiled the smallest amount. The line, he said, goes where the stake is. And there it was, the whole of it, in 6 words, though she did not yet know it was the whole of it. The line goes where the stake is. She would carry that sentence around with her for a month, like a stone in a boot, and one night in the rain she would understand exactly what it meant, and go cold all through. But that morning it only sounded like a rich company's arithmetic, and she let it be, because the dock men were watching, and a woman who argues with a printed notice in front of laughing men has already lost the part of the argument that other people can see. She was 31 years old that spring and looked, the town agreed, older, though no one could have said in what. There was a single early thread of gray at her left temple that she did not trouble to hide. She wore a faded blue prairie dress gone the color of a June sky at noon, and over it a stained canvas-work apron with a nail pocket sagging at the hip, and on her hands her father's teamster gloves, too big, the fingers worn pale. Her hair was dark and heavy, and she wore it braided and pinned up under a man's felt hat when she worked, which was every hour she was awake. She was not a beauty, and had never been told she was, and she had learned long ago to stand in a way that took up exactly as much room as she needed, and no more, which in a town of loud men reads as either meekness or contempt, and people generally chose to read it as whichever suited them. They called her the deserted wife, in Stanford and Utica, and out along the Judith. And they said it the way you would name a disease, softly and with a little step back. 2 years before, in the spring of '85, Tom Ballard had ridden west out of the yard on a borrowed sorrel toward the silver camps at Castle and Neihart, with a rolled blanket and $40 and a promise, and the promise was the last of him she ever had. In the fall, the sorrel came home. It came home alone, gaunt and galled, dragging a broken picket rope, and it stood at the gate in the cold and whickered at the barn until she came out with a lantern, and there was no note tied to it, and no man on it, and no man behind it on the road, and there never was again. She had fed the sorrel and doctored the rope burn and turned it out with the others, and she had gone on. That was the thing the town could not forgive her, in the end, that she had gone on. A wife whose husband dies is a widow, and a widow has a place. The church knows what to do with her, and the men know how to speak to her, and the story has an end that everyone can hold. But a wife whose husband simply goes, and does not come back, and does not die where anyone can point to it. She is a question with no bottom, and people do not like to stand near a question with no bottom. So they had settled it among themselves that Tom Ballard had left because there was something wrong with the woman or the place, some coldness or hardness or ill luck, and that the Ford and the 60 acres and the failing little horse ranch on Willow Creek were all of a piece with it, a thing going down that a sensible person stepped away from. When the railroad came to take the Ford, the general feeling in town was not pity. It was a kind of relief, as when a long illness finally names its day. What none of them said, because none of them let themselves think it long enough to say, was that the 60 acres of Willow Creek bottom that Josiah Vane had proved up and left to his only daughter were the best deeded ground in the valley, and that the ford across the creek at the foot of the home meadow was the one place a loaded wagon could cross Willow Creek dry axle in high water between the Box Canyon above and the Alkali Flats 11 miles below. Every freighter in the Judith knew that ford. The stage had used it. The army had used it going up to the agency. Josiah had kept the approaches graveled and the willows cut back for 30 years, and had charged no toll, because he said a crossing was a thing put in the ground for everyone, and a man who fenced it would answer for it. His daughter had kept it the same way, alone, for 2 years, and it had never once occurred to the town that keeping it was work, or that the work was skilled, until the railroad wanted it, and a soft-handed man in a good coat stood up to explain that it had never really been hers at all. She rolled the notice off the nail with 2 fingers. When Pryor had gone, he did not stay to see her read it. And she stood in the sun and read every word of it, slowly, the way her father had taught her to read anything with a printed seal on it, which was to assume that the person who wrote it was trying to take something from you and had hidden where in the wording. 30 days. $90. Offered, not owed. Right of way for the main line of the Territorial and Northern, as located and staked by the company's engineers across the northwest quarter along the surveyed center line. Removal of improvements at owner's cost. A hearing before the Territorial Condemnation Commissioner, one Harl Dutcher, set for the 28th of June, at which objections, if any, might be shown. And at the bottom, small, the thing that turned her stomach over once and set it down again cold. The notice had been posted at the instance of the company, and the company's agent of record for the right-of-way and for the resale of surplus was Aldous Pryor. She did not understand that last line yet. Surplus. Resale. She filed it the way her father had taught her, to file the wording that did not fit, not arguing with it, not forgetting it, only setting it on a high shelf in her mind where she could take it down later and turn it in better light. Then she rolled the notice small and put it in her apron pocket with the nails, and she walked the length of the dock to where her wagon stood, past the men. And she did not hurry, and she did not slow, and she did not look at any of them, and behind her the low laugh came again, and Boone the teamster said something she was meant to half hear, about a woman who could not keep a husband keeping a Ford. And the clerks laughed, and she went on and loaded her sack of oats and her coil of new wire, and climbed to the seat and clucked to the old sorrel. The same sorrel. She had never sold it, and drove out of Stanford toward home with her back straight and her hands quiet on the lines, and a cold, clear thing forming in her chest that was not anger, or was anger worn all the way down to something harder and more useful. If you have ever been the person the room had already decided about before you spoke, if you have ever stood in the sun and felt a town settle its verdict on you like dust, then you know the particular quiet Esther Ballard drove home in that morning, and you might want to know how it came out. So I will tell you, the whole of it, the way the old people told a thing on a long evening, slow and with nothing left out, and if it keeps you company you might follow along. For I have a good many of these to tell, and they are all, in the end, the same story, which is the story of a thing everybody had learned to call worthless, and the one person who had not yet learned it. But that is the end, and we are at the beginning, on a wagon road in May, with 30 days, and a called note, and a horse we have not met yet. The road to Willow Creek ran up the east side of the valley under the Judith rims, through country just going green, the cottonwoods along the water in new leaf, and the benchland grass still short, and the mountains north of the basin blue and streaked with the last of the snow. It was beautiful, and she barely saw it. She was doing the sum, the way she did it every day. The way she had done it every day for 2 years, adding the Ford and the note and the 30 days and the price of oats and the 14 head of horses she was wintering through on hope, and getting, as always, the same answer, which was that there was no answer, only the next thing to do and then the next thing after that. Her father had taught her that too. When the sum will not come out, he said, stop doing the sum. Do the chore in front of your hands. The chore in front of your hands is always solvable. It was, she thought, the only religion he had really had, and it had served her better than the other kind. She came over the last rise, and there was the place below her, and she stopped the wagon a moment the way she always did, to look. The log house her father had built, low and long and chinked white, with the sod-roofed lean to she had added herself. The pole corrals, the good log barn, the home meadow green as a table down to the willows, and the creek bright through them, and the ford, her ford, a pale gravel apron where the water spread wide and shallow and talked over the stones. 14 horses grazing the far bench, mostly plain stock. A few good ones, all of them worth less than they should be, because the market was bad, and the buyers knew a woman alone could not hold out for a price. And below the ford, where the railroad's grade came up the valley from the south, the raw new cut in the hillside, red and yellow raw earth, and the beginnings of a timber trestle over the little side coulee, and the work train smoke standing up thin and gray in the still morning 3 miles off. The two worlds, hers and theirs, and the creek between them, and the ford the one place the creek let them touch. And there was one more thing in the picture that morning. Though she did not know yet that it was going to be the most important thing in it, the thing all the rest of it would turn on. Far down the valley, past the grade, at the Utica auction pens the company had thrown up to sell off condemned and worn-out stock, there was a horse in a pen by himself. A big storm-colored gray, standing with his head up and his ears back, and a rope on him that no man wanted to be the one to hold, and he had 4 days to live. But she did not know that yet either. She clucked to the sorrel and drove down to the house and unloaded the oats and the wire and started the evening chores, because the chore in front of her hands was the evening chores, and the gray and the flood and the whole long turning of it were still a little way off down the road, coming on. The note fell due on the 9th of August, but it had been made a lever long before that. Josiah Vane had died owing no man, but he had died, and dying is expensive on a ranch, and the winter after had been hard, and Esther had borrowed $400 from the Stanford Bank against the horses and the next season, the way ranch people do, meaning to pay it out of the fall gather and the spring full crop. She had made every interest payment on the day, walking the money in herself in coin, and old Josiah Vane the banker, no kin, only the same common name that lay over half that country, had told her twice that her account was the soundest small paper he held, and had meant it. Then, in April, a thing had changed. The bank had written her a stiff little letter, in a clerk's hand and not the old man's, reminding her that the note was payable in full at maturity, and that the bank reserved its rights as to the security. And when she had ridden in to ask what had changed, she had been kept waiting an hour, and then told the president was engaged. She had seen, going out, whose good gray coat was hung on the hook inside the president's door. She had not understood it then. She was beginning to now, for it is a simple machine once you see it, and it is built the same in every valley where this story has ever happened. A man wants a thing you have and will not sell. He cannot simply take it, because there is law, and the law, for all its faults, does make a man show a reason. So he does not reach for the thing. He reaches for the ground under you. He finds the note you owe, and he leans on the man who holds it, and the note that was a patient thing becomes a sudden thing. He finds the season you are counting on, and he fouls it. He finds the crossing or the water or the road you cannot do without, and he wraps it in enough paper that your having it looks like you're stealing it. And all the while he keeps his voice low and his coat clean. And he lets other men do the laughing, so that when the smoke clears it will look as though the country simply came to its senses about you, and no single hand will be found on the knife. Esther did not have the whole picture that spring, but she had grown up the daughter of a man who read wording for a living, and she knew the smell of a machine when she was standing inside one, and she had smelled it the day she saw the gray coat on the hook. She met Wade Coburn the second morning, at the ford, in a dispute that was not one. She had ridden down at first light to check the approaches after a night of up-valley rain, because a ford is a living thing, and a night of rain can move a bar or cut a new channel, and a wise crossing person reads it fresh each morning before trusting a wheel to it, and she found a company survey crew already there. 3 men with a transit and a rod and a fresh cedar stake and a bucket of white paint driving the stake into the gravel at the very head of her ford. A 4th man set a big company mule to the side and watched them, and did not get down to help, and she took him at first for the boss of them, and rode up ready for the boss of them. "You're setting that in my crossing," she said. The man on the mule looked at the stake, and at the crew, and laughed at her. And he had a long scarred jaw and gray in his mustache, and the flat, unbothered eyes of a man who had been shot at by professionals and found civilians easy company by comparison. "I'm not setting anything," he said. "I haul for the road. They set stakes. I haul what the stakes tell me to haul." He nodded at the transit crew. "That's Mr. Pryor's locating party. You've a quarrel with the stake. It's his stake." "It's the wrong stake," she said. "Might be," he said, and that was all. But he said it in a way the 3 men at the transit did not, a way that took the possibility seriously and set it down without picking it up, and Esther marked him for it, the way you mark the one dry match in a wet box, without yet needing it. His name was Wade Coburn, and he was the road's teamster boss and bridge foreman, in charge of the draft stock and the trestle timber and the daily freight up the grade, an old cavalryman who had soldiered in the Nez Perce trouble and come out of the army with a bad hip and a good name and no use for men who abused stock or ground. He did not, that first morning, take her side. He took no side. But he watched her do a thing the transit crew found comical, and he did not find comical at all, which was that she got down off her horse and waded into her own ford in her boots, upstream and down, feeling the bottom through the soles the way a person reads a page in the dark, and came out and told the crew flatly that the true head of the crossing was 11 paces above their stake, on the gravel bench, where it had been since before any of them were born, and that if the railroad tried to bring a loaded wagon over where they had staked it, in high water, it would drop a wheel in the soft cut below the bar, and they would lose the load, and maybe the team. The crew laughed. Wade Coburn did not. He looked at the water where she pointed. A long time. With the eyes of a man who had lost a team in a river once and never stopped paying for it, and he said nothing, and he remembered. She rode home that morning by way of the high bench above the ford, and she stopped her horse at the section corner her father had set in '71, a squared granite post, sunk deep, with the government cross cut in the top and the mark still sharp. And she sat and looked at it a while. From that corner her father had run his lines. From that corner, she knew, without a chain in her hands, that the surveyed centerline of any road following the valley grade came down off the bench and crossed Willow Creek above the gravel bar, on the sound rock, clear of her deeded ford by the width of the home meadow. She had watched him run it. She had dragged the chain for him, link by link, a girl of 9 with the brass biting her palms, while he called the count and set the hubs. The land does not move, he used to say. Men move the paint. Count the chain, not the stake. She had not thought of that sentence in 20 years. It came back to her that morning at the corner, in his voice, and it sat down in her chest next to the cold, clear thing, and the two of them kept company there all the rest of the way home, and for a good many days after. She had not meant to go to the Utica pens at all. She had gone to sell, not to buy, for she needed money and not another mouth, and the company auctioneer was clearing a string of worn-out and condemned stock that Friday, and there was talk of buyers up from the forts, and she took 3 of her plainer geldings down the valley on a lead, thinking to catch a fort buyer and turn them into a payment on the note. She did not catch a fort buyer. The fort buyer had come and gone the day before and taken the sound stock at a price that made her want to sit down in the road, and what was left at the pens on Friday was the bottom of the bucket, spavined mules, wind-broke saddlers, a blind mare, and, in a plank pen off by itself, with a man's coat thrown over the top rail as a warning flag, the gray. She heard him before she saw him. There was a sound out of that pen like nothing else in the yard, a low, blowing, trembling sound, the sound of a big animal holding itself very still at a great cost, and under it the knock of a heavy body coming up against planks and going away again. Men were standing back from the pen, in the loose half-circle men make around a thing they are afraid of, and will not say they are afraid of. Someone had a whip. Someone else had a lariat built up into a big careless loop, the loop of a man who means to rope from outside the fence and does not care much where it catches, and inside the pen, backed into the far corner with the whites of his eyes showing all the way round and his head flung up as high as the top rail and higher, was the biggest gray stallion she had ever seen. 16 hands and better, stormed dark over the loins, and going to silver at the crest and the tail, ribbed up with hunger and streaked with dried sweat and old dirt, and beautiful, God help her, beautiful the way a thunderhead is beautiful, the kind of thing you know to get in out of, and cannot stop looking at. That's the man-killer, a man beside her said, glad to have someone new to tell. threw Ab Sample in the spring and stove 3 of his ribs, and would have finished him if Boone hadn't got a rope on him. Companies had 4 men try him. Won't lead, won't drive, won't take a bit without he goes over backward. Auctioneer's not even going to run him through, going to knock him down to the killers for what his hide brings, and good riddance. You'd have to be simple to give $1 for that. He looked at her sideways when he said it, at the woman alone with 3 plain geldings on a string, and he grinned, because it was a fine joke to make, the simple one and the killer, and she did not rise to it. She was watching the horse's mouth, for that was the thing her father had drilled into her before she was 10, the thing that separated the people who read animals from the people who only handled them. You did not watch a frightened horse's feet, or his ears, or even his eyes. First, you watched what he did with his mouth, because the mouth is where a man's cruelty goes into a horse, and where you can read, if you know how, the exact history of hands that have been on him. And the gray, when the man with the whip fainted at him to make him show off his temper for the crowd, did a thing that stopped Esther's breath and set it down changed. He did not fight the whip. He flinched from something that was not there. He threw his nose up and to the side and gaped his mouth open and clamped it shut and shook his head as though a wasp were in it. And he did it the instant the man's arm moved, before the whip could have reached him, and she understood, the way you understand a whole sentence from one word, that it was not the whip he was answering. It was a bit. Somewhere in this horse's past there was a bit, and a hand behind the bit, that had taught him that a raised arm meant a thing was about to be done to his mouth that he could not bear and could not escape, and everything the yard was calling meanness was this horse screaming in the only language left to him about that. She did not buy him to save him. She wants that understood. In the telling, she was not a woman who could afford to buy sorrow, and she had learned young to keep her wanting on a short rope. She stood at the rail a long time doing the sum, for she did the sum on everything, and the sum for once came out. A horse that size, sound in the leg, which he was under the dirt, 16 hands of bone and heart, was worth $200 broke and gentle, and worth nothing at all as he stood, and the whole distance between nothing and $200 was a thing about his mouth that she believed, watching him, that she knew how to mend, because she had mended it twice before in lesser horses, and because her father had mended it a dozen times, and let her hold the twitch and talk low while he did. If she was right, she would turn $3 into $200 by the fall, which was more than she would make on the 3 plain geldings on her string, and $200 was half the note. If she was wrong, she would be out $3 and a good deal of danger. It was, she decided, the soundest bet on the yard, and no one else at the rail could see it, and that the thing everyone else has decided is worthless, that you alone can see the worth of, is the whole of this business, and the whole of this story, and I will not pretend she was not glad, under the arithmetic, to be the one who saw it. So when the auctioneer, as a joke to warm the crowd before the real selling, sang out that he had a fine gray saddle stallion, kind and gentle, who would take anyone anywhere, and asked the yard what he was bid, and the yard roared, and a wag hollered $1, Esther Ballard said 3, in a voice that carried without being raised, and the yard turned to look at her, and the auctioneer, delighted, cried $3, $3, do I hear a killing price? And the killers, who had come to buy him for his hide and no more, looked at the woman and looked at the horse and decided, to a man, that they would rather not bid against whatever was about to happen, and let him go. $3. The auctioneer knocked him down to Mrs. Ballard, Willow Creek, with a flourish and a wink at the crowd, and the crowd gave her the laugh, the big easy laugh, and she walked up to sign the book and pay her $3 silver and take the rope of a horse 4 grown men had failed to hold alone in front of all of them, and her hands did not shake, though she made sure afterward to notice that they had wanted to. Wade Coburn was at the pens that day on the company's business, and he watched the whole of it from the seat of a freight wagon, and he did not laugh. When the yard had had its fun and drifted off to the real selling and left the woman standing at the pen with $3 gone and a killer to get 11 miles home, he brought his wagon around and stopped it and sat looking down at the gray and at her, and he said, in his flat way, "You'll not lead him." "No," she said, "not today. Rope him to the tailgate and he'll fight it the whole way and hurt himself or you. I know it." So he waited. She was undoing something at the pen gate, a slow, methodical something, and he saw that she had a plain snaffle bridle in her hands, a smooth, thick mouthpiece, the gentlest bit made, and a good long cotton lead, and that she was warming the bit in her two hands, breathing on the metal, the way you warm a bit on a cold morning so it does not shock a horse's mouth, except it was not a cold morning. "He'll not take a bit," Wade said. 4 men learned that. 4 men, Esther said, warmed the bit in a fire, most like, or not at all, and then they raised their arm. And she went into the pen. What Wade Coburn saw in the next hour he told about for the rest of his life, and never got anyone who had not been there to quite believe, and stopped trying. She did not corner the horse. She went into the middle of the pen and stood, sideways to him, not looking at him, the warmed bit and the folded lead held low and loose, and she began to talk, not baby talk. Just talk, low and level and endless, the price of oats and the state of the road and her father and the weather. A river of quiet words with no edges on any of them, and she let the horse come apart at her, and put himself back together and come apart again, and she did not move toward him, and she did not move away, and every time his eye came round to her, she let her own eyes slide off, giving him the one thing 4 men and a whip had never given him, which was the absence of a demand. It took 40 minutes before he licked and chewed, that small working of the mouth that means a horse has let a breath all the way down, and it took 20 more before he dropped his head, and it was near an hour before she raised her hand, slowly, palm down, nowhere near his head, only into the air where he could see it was empty, and he flinched, the whole great body of him, and she stopped the hand and held it, and talked, and let him look at the empty hand until the hand stopped meaning what it had meant. And then, and only then, an inch at a time, with the warm bit flat on her open palm and no strap raised anywhere, she offered his ruined mouth the gentlest thing it had felt in years, and the gray, trembling all over like water in a pail, opened his jaw and took the bit. He led home like a gentleman. Not a broke gentleman, not a safe one. She would not have turned her back on him yet for money, but a horse who had been given a reason to try one more time and was trying. Walking at her shoulder the 11 miles up the valley in the long light, with his ears working and his eye on her, and Wade Coburn drove his empty wagon a quarter mile behind them the whole way. At a walk, not offering to help and not going on ahead, which she understood was his way of seeing her home, without saying he was seeing her home. And at the mouth of her lane he touched his hat and turned the wagon and went back down the darkening valley without a word, and she stood a moment and watched him go before she took the gray on in. She did not have a word for what she felt, watching him go. She had put such words away 2 years before with the sorrel at the gate, folded and high on a shelf, and she left them there. But she noticed the shelf. That was new. She noticed that there was a shelf. She called him Ransom. She did not decide to. It was only what came, the second night, when she stood at his stall with the lantern and looked at the healed white scars she had found at last by daylight along the bars of his lower jaw, the even cross-laid ridges that only one thing in the world makes, a twisted wire bit run by a hand that hauls on it, and understood the whole of his history in her hand the way she had understood it from the rail, and thought, without meaning to, there is the ransom somebody paid, and there is what it bought, and looked at the horse the country had thrown away for the price of his hide and known. The way you know a true thing before you can defend it. That he was worth more than the Ford and the note and the whole of the summer coming. And that the two of them, the cast-off woman and the cast-off horse, had been handed to each other for some purpose she could not yet read. The way you are handed the first tool of a job before you have been told what the job is. The days that followed were the good days, though she did not know to call them that until later, when she had the flood and the hearing to weigh them against. She had 30 days shrinking to 20, and a note past that, and every reason to spend her hours in fear, and instead she spent them, most of them, on her knees in the round pen with the gray, and on her feet in the Ford with a shovel and a chain. And she was, in a way she would have been ashamed to admit to the church, happy. There is a particular happiness in doing skilled work well that the world has told you is beyond you. And she had a double ration of it that June, for she was doing 2 such works at once, mending a horse no man could mend, and preparing a case no woman was supposed to be able to read. And the fear stood off at the edge of it like a coyote at the edge of the firelight, real and watching, and kept back by the light. She worked the gray every dawn and every dusk, and she worked him the way her father had taught her, which was never to take a thing by force that could be had by patience, because a thing taken by force has to be taken again every day, and a thing had by patience is yours. She threw away the idea of breaking him. You do not break a thing that is already broken, you mend it. She built his mouth back an ounce at a time, riding him at last, bareback in the round pen, and then saddled in the meadow, and she found under the fear the horse his first owner must have seen before the wire ruined him, bold, honest, quick, with a great engine in his hindquarters, and a way of locking onto a task and going at it with his whole heart. The rarest thing in a horse, the willingness that cannot be trained in and can only be ruined out. Someone had nearly ruined it out of him. She was putting it back, and she thought, more than once, brushing the storm dark-eyed down at night, that whoever had done the ruining had known exactly what he was ruining, had taken a bold, honest horse and patiently taught him to be a killer, and that was not the work of a hot temper or a hard season. That was the work of a cold, patient man, and the county was full of hard men, but she could think of only one cold, patient one, and she made herself stop thinking it, because she had no proof. And a woman with no proof and too much certainty is halfway to being the crazy widow they already said she was. And she worked the Ford. Every dry evening she took the shovel and the wheelbarrow and a coil of her new wire down to the crossing and worked the approaches the way her father had, cutting the willows back, graveling the soft place below the bar where a wheel could drop, reading the water as it dropped through June, and marking on a peeled post at the bank the height of it day by day, low mark and high mark, the way he had taught her. Because a Ford is not one thing, it is 100 Fords, a different one at every height of water, and a person who means to trust her life to a crossing had better know all 100 of them. She knew them. She knew that Ford the way she knew the inside of her own house in the dark, where the true gravel ran, and where the soft cut lay, and where in a real rise, the only safe line bent upstream around the drowned boulder her father had named the Deacon, a line no eye could see from the bank and no stranger could find, a line you had to know or be told or drown looking for. She did not know yet that this knowledge, which was the least marketable thing she owned, a thing worth nothing to anyone, was going to be worth, before the summer was out, an entire railroad. But her father would have known. Nothing you learn about the ground is ever wasted, he used to say. The day will come when the ground asks you what you know, and you had better have an answer. Wade Coburn came up the valley on the road's business every few days, and he took to stopping. Not for long, and never with a reason he would name. He would rein in at the ford where she was working, or lean on the corral while she rode the gray, and say some flat small thing and listen to her answer, and say another, and go on. He watched her ride the gray and said, "Once, 2 seasons ago, I told the company that horse was worth $200, and they wire bidded him to save a week of gentling, and made a killer, and I quit arguing. Because arguing with the company is a way of getting yourself hauled off the payroll, which I have a use for." He looked at the gray a while. The man that ran the wire on him drives for Pryor now. He said it flat, looking at the horse, not at her, and then he changed the subject to the state of the trestle. But he had said it, and they both knew he had chosen to say it, and it was the first plank of the thing he would end by giving her, which was the truth about the men he worked for, at the cost of the only work he had. "Why do you tell me that?" she asked him once. Plainly, because she was not a woman who let a gift lie unnamed on the ground between two people. He was quiet a while. "Because you read that ford right in front of 3 men who laughed at you," he said. "And they were wrong and you were right. And I have spent 30 years watching men be wrong with confidence, and it has worn a place in me. And because I have hauled freight over a bad crossing, that a man staked wrong to save himself trouble, and buried what it cost, and I do not care to do it again." He set his hat. "And because they are going to take your ground, Mrs. Ballard, and it is not going to be square how they do it, and a man gets to a certain age and finds he would rather be poor and able to look at the shaving glass than fed and not." That was the longest speech she ever heard him make, and he seemed embarrassed by it, and went off down the valley directly after, and she stood and watched him go, and noticed the shelf again. She had to go into Stanford for nails and coffee and a keg of the tar she doctored hooves with, and the feed store was full when she came in. Of course it was full. A rainy noon with the graders in town. And the talk stopped the particular way talk stops, not all at once but in a falling ripple, when she came through the door, and picked up again lower and with a shape to it. Boone was there, and 2 of Pryor's men, and the storekeeper, a decent enough coward named Ackley, who did not meet her eye, and they let her get halfway through her list before Boone said, to the room and not to her, that he heard the widow had bought herself a husband at last, a big gray one, 4 legs and a mean streak, and no back talk, and that it was about the size of man she could hold. The room laughed. She counted out her coins onto the counter and did not turn around and said, to Ackley, in her level voice, "And the tar. The pine tar, not the coal. A quart." And Ackley got the tar, and the laugh had nowhere to go and died, because a laugh needs the laughed at to flinch and feed it, and she would not. She never would. And they had not yet learned that about her, though they were learning. But she heard, under the coarse talk, a finer thread, and being her father's daughter she pulled it. One of Pryor's men, quieter, said to the other, not meaning her to catch it, that it would all be settled by August anyway, that the Townsite Company had the whole flat below the crossing under option already, and only wanted the crossing to make the lots worth building on, and that a man who bought in Willow Junction now, before the road's crossing was fixed, would treble his money by fall. Townsite Company. Willow Junction. She had never heard the name of a town at her ford. Because there was no town at her ford, there was her father's meadow and her father's crossing. But there was, it seemed, a town on paper, a town in some clean office, laid out in lots over her hayground, waiting only for the crossing to be taken and the line fixed and the whole thing to become, by the arithmetic of soft-handed men, real. She bought her nails and her tar and her coffee, and rode home in the rain, turning the new thread in her fingers, and it led, when she followed it, exactly where the other threads led, into the good gray coat, and she understood a little more of the size of the thing she was inside, and was not comforted, but was not surprised either. And a person who is inside a machine is better off knowing its size than not. She rode the gray in the open for the first time on a still evening in the middle of June, out of the round pen and down the home meadow toward the ford. And it was a thing she had not planned as a public act, and that became one. Because a neighbor, a hay rancher named Deal from down the valley, happened to be riding the county road along her fence line and stopped his horse to watch, the way a man stops to watch a house fire, expecting the worst and half hoping for it. What he saw instead, he carried up and down the Judith for a month, unable to make it come out as small as he wanted it to. He saw the widow Ballard, who had bought a man-killer for $3 as a joke on herself, ride that killer down her own meadow at a walk and a jog and a soft lope on a loose rein, turn him and stop him, and back him with no more than a shift of her weight, ride him to the very edge of the loud water at the ford, and sit him there quiet while he lowered his head and drank. The horsefore grown company men could not bridle standing hip-shot and gentle under a woman's hand in the last gold. Light, and Deal rode home and told his wife he did not know what he had seen, but that it was not what the town said it was, and his wife told another wife, and so the first small crack ran out through the county's certainty, weeks before the chain and the flood, a hairline. But there, Wade Coburn found her at the ford one of those evenings and watched her doctor the gray's feet, and he told her, unasked, sitting on the bank with a stem of grass in his teeth, the piece of himself that explained why he kept climbing the valley to a woman who could do him no good, and a cause that could only cost him. He had lost a team and a wagon and a boy driver in the Powder River in '76, he said. At a crossing a lieutenant had ordered against his word, because the lieutenant had a map, and Wade only had his eyes and 30 years, and the map said the ford was good, and his eyes said the water was wrong. And the map won, because a map with a seal on it always wins over a man with only his eyes. And the boy had drowned, and Wade had pulled him out a mile down, and had never, in 11 years, stopped seeing it. So when I watch you wade into your own creek, and read it against 3 men and a transit, he said, and be right, and get laughed at for being right, he did not finish it. He got up and set his hat and went to help her with the near hind, which was his way of finishing it. And they doctored the horse's feet together in the dusk, 2 people who had each been overruled by a map when they had the truth in their hands, and had each buried what it cost, and had each decided late and at a price that they would not stand quiet for it again. The nights were the hardest, because the days had work in them, and the nights had only the sum. She would do the chores by lantern, and feed the gray, and stand with him a while in the barn, where the one warm animal smell of him was better company than any human words. And then she would go up to the empty house, and sit at the plank table, with the oilcloth packet, and the notice, and the called note letter laid out, and turn them, and turn them. And the fear would come in and sit across the table from her wearing the good gray coat, and she would let it sit there, because she had learned, you cannot put fear out of the house, you can only refuse to feed it, and she would not feed it. She would do the next chore instead, even at midnight, even if the next chore was only to oil the brass chain a hand's length at a time. Link by link, her father's chain, the government's measure, the one thing in the house that could not be argued with, and the oiling of it was a kind of prayer she had in place of the other kind, and it steadied her. And when the chain was oiled, she would go to bed, and get up, and do the day. And I will say a thing here plainly, because it is the middle of the story, and the middle of the story is where a listener needs it said. You may be waiting, as the county waited, for the moment the woman breaks, or weeps, or is rescued, because that is how the story usually goes when the person in the middle of the machine is a woman alone, and I want to tell you that moment is not coming, and its not coming is the whole point of the thing. She was afraid, and did not break. She was mocked, and did not answer. She was alone, and did not send for anyone, and when a good man came up the valley of his own accord, she let him come but did not lean. because she had learned 2 years before at a gate in the cold, with a horse and no husband, that the only floor that will surely hold your weight is the one you have stood on and tested yourself. She did not read the Ford so a man would be proud of her. She read the Ford because the Ford is real and can be read, and reading it true is the work in front of the hands. That is not a hard woman, whatever the county said. That is a woman who has found the one solid thing in a shifting country and set her whole weight on it, which is the ground, and the reading of the ground. And I have never in all these stories found a better thing for a person to set their weight on, man or woman, and neither, in the end, had she. The thing that had been on the high shelf in her mind came down on a Tuesday, when Pryor's locating party set a second stake. She rode down at dawn and found it, a fresh cedar stake driven a little below the first, and a length of string run between the two and out into the meadow with rag flags on it, marking the company's centerline plane across the middle of her Ford and up over the graveled apron her family had kept for 30 years. And she sat her horse and looked at the string a long time, and then she got down and walked the string, heel to toe, counting her paces, up onto the bench toward the section corner, and the string did not go to the section corner. It bent. A surveyed centerline does not bend without a reason set in the field notes. Her father had taught her that a bend is a decision, and every decision is written down somewhere. This bend had no reason in the ground. It swung wide of the sound rock crossing above the bar. The crossing any honest engineer would take, the crossing she would have bet her life the field notes called for, and came down instead across her deeded Ford, and swung back above, and the only thing the bend accomplished, the only thing in the world it did, was to put her crossing inside the right-of-way and the sound rock crossing outside it. And she stood in the wet grass with the sun coming out all at once, the way a lock comes open, and heard the soft voice on the depot dock say, "The line goes where the stake is," and understood at last that it had not been arithmetic. It had been a confession, and she had been too proud that day to hear a man confess. She did not run to anyone with it. She had no proof, only a bend and a certainty, and she knew exactly how a bend and a certainty would sound coming out of the mouth of the deserted widow woman who had bought a killer horse for $3. It would sound like the beginning of the crazy they were all waiting for. So she did the thing her father had raised her to do, which was to go and get the proof and lay hands on it before she opened her mouth. And the proof, she knew, was two things: her father's brass Gunter's chain, and the truth of the ground counted out in it, link by link, against the stake, in front of a witness who could not be waved off. The chain was in the barn, wrapped in oilcloth in her father's old survey box, where it had lain since his hands last folded it, 66 feet of it, 100 links of hand-forged brass, the government's own measure, the thing every legal line in that country had been born from. She took it down that night, and cleaned it, and laid it out in the lantern light, and ran her fingers along the links, and it was like taking her father's hand again. And she said out loud, to the barn and the horse and the dark, in his words, the land was here before the paint. Count the chain, not the stake. And the gray turned his head at the sound of her voice, and she went and stood with him a while, and then she went to bed, and did not sleep, and got up before the rain. It had begun to rain in the mountains that night, up at the head of the Judith, a warm rain on the last of the high snow, the worst kind, the kind that brings a creek up fast and brown. And by the gray hour before dawn, Willow Creek was talking louder than it had all June, a deeper note, and she heard it change in the dark, and knew the water was coming up, and she was glad of it. God forgive her, because a rising creek meant the company's temporary crossing downstream. The cheap pole and brush affair they had thrown across the narrows to move their freight while they built the trestle was about to be in trouble, and trouble for the company's crossing meant her Ford, her hated condemned Ford, was about to be the only way over Willow Creek in 11 miles, at the exact moment the company needed a way over most. She did not yet see the whole of what that meant. But she felt the shape of it turn under her, the way you feel a big fish turn under a boat. And she got up and dressed in her father's slicker, and took the chain and a lantern, and went down to the ford in the rain to count the lie while she still could, before the rising water drowned the evidence for the summer. She was not alone at the ford. Wade Coburn was there, on foot in a streaming oilskin, having ridden up in the dark because he did not trust the company's poleway in a rise and wanted to see the real ford with his own eyes before he had to bring freight over something. And he found her at the section corner in the lantern light with a brass chain in her hands and the rain coming down, and he did not ask her what she was doing. He picked up the far end of the chain. He had dragged chain for the army, surveying roads and telegraph, and his hands knew it, and the two of them ran her father's line in the rain and the dark from the granite corner down toward the ford. And she called the count the way her father had taught her, chain and mark, and set the pins, and Wade carried the head and drove the pins where she called. And the rain ran off their hats, and the creek came up brown and loud below them, and link by link, chain by chain, the government's own measure walked down the bench and told them, in a language that could not lie and could not be waved off and would stand up in any court in the territory, exactly where the true center line of the road had to run. It ran to the Sound Rock crossing above the bar. It missed her deeded ford clean. And the fresh cedar stake Pryor's men had driven at the head of her crossing stood 11 full chains, 726 feet, off the true line, in ground it had no business in, painted white and authoritative and false. Wade Coburn stood in the rain and looked at the stake and looked at the last pin, and did the arithmetic a chain at a time the way she had, and she watched the thing settle onto him that had settled onto her at the bend. And he said, at last quietly, over the noise of the water, "That's not a survey error." "No," she said. "A survey error is a foot. A survey error is a link. That's a decision. Somebody pulled the true stake and set that one, and wrote a bend into the notes to cover it, and the only thing the bend does is put my ford inside and the rock crossing outside," she said. Yes, he was quiet. Then he said the thing that turned the key the rest of the way, the thing she had felt the shape of and not been able to grasp. "The road doesn't want your ford, Mrs. Ballard. The road's engineer wants the rock crossing. It's better ground and cheaper timber, and any fool can see it. Pryor's not moving the line to get the road a crossing. He's moving the line to condemn your crossing cheap, $90, condemned, and then the road still needs a way over, and there's the rock crossing sitting right there above the bar, on ground that'll be surplus once your ford's inside the taking. Surplus he's the agent for. Surplus he can sell the road at whatever a sound crossing's worth to a railroad that's got to be over the water by a date or lose its land grant. He's going to buy your whole crossing for $90 with the law's own hand and sell the road half of it back for a fortune, and the difference goes in his pocket and a commissioner's, and you'll be the squatter woman who lost in court, and no one will ever count the chain." And there, in the rain, at the bottom of the night, the three truths lay side by side in the lantern light, where she could see the whole of the machine at last. The first was the horse. The killer was made, not born. Wire and force laid on a bold, honest animal by a cold, patient hand, the same hand, Pryor's own teamster, that she now understood had been turned on the horse for the same reason it would be turned on her. Because a bold, honest thing that will not be bought must be publicly ruined so that no one believes it was ever worth anything. The second was the line, moved, not mistaken, a lie counted out in brass, the true crossing stolen with paint and paper. And the third was the why, and the clock. Pryor did not need her ford, he needed it condemned and her broken. So the note would fall, and the deed be his to sell, and the difference be his to keep, and the rising creek that was drowning the company's poleway, even as they stood there, had just made her Ford, her condemned worthless Ford, the only way the road could get its engineer and its payroll across Willow Creek to pass the land grant inspection before the grant lapsed. The flood and the fraud had become the same problem. And the only creature in the valley that could carry the answer across that water in the dark was standing dry in her barn 11 miles up the road, a horse the county had condemned to the killers for the price of his hide, waiting, though none of them knew it yet, to be asked. They wound the chain in the rain, and Wade drove the pins deep and left them. Every one witnessed and set, and they walked back up to the barn together, not saying much, and she made coffee, and they sat at the plank table in the kitchen, with the lantern between them and the rain on the sod roof, and she opened the oilcloth packet at last. The one she had carried out of the fire once and kept dry through 2 years of ruin, and laid its papers on the table, her father's original land office plat of the township, in his own fine hand, with the section corners and the true traverse of Willow Creek, the patent to the 60 acres, sealed and recorded, and a copy, in the same hand, of the chief locating engineer's field notes for the very railroad grade now cut into the hill below, for her father, before he died, had done contract survey work for the road itself, and had kept his copies, because a man who reads wording for a living keeps his copies. And the field notes, the road's own field notes, in the road's own engineer's reckoning, put the center line at the rock crossing, above the bar clear of her Ford. The paper and the paint did not agree. And when a paper and a paint do not agree, her father used to say, the paper was written by a man who thought no one would ever check, and the paint was laid by a man who was sure of it. She made her mistake the next morning, and it was the honest person's mistake, which is to believe that showing a dishonest man that you have caught him will make him stop. She rode to Stanford in the clearing weather with the chain count in her head and the plat in her apron, not to Pryor but to the commissioner, Harl Dutcher, meaning to lay the true line before the authority and be done, and she found Dutcher a fat, comfortable man in a clean office, who listened to her with his fingers laced on his stomach and his eyes going to the window, and who told her, when she had finished, that the matter of the survey was a matter for the hearing on the 28th, and that she would have every chance to show her objections then, in the proper form, with proper counsel, and that he could not discuss a pending cause with a party, and that she would excuse him. And as she went out she passed, in the outer room, Aldous Pryor waiting, with his good coat and his folder, rising to go in as she came out, and he gave her his small sideways look, and said, gently, you oughtn't to trouble the commissioner, Mrs. Ballard. It only makes a poor impression. And she understood, going down the stairs, that she had just told the fox exactly which way the hens would run. The note was called that Friday. Not due, called, the whole of it, $400, on a technicality of the security clause that no one had ever enforced in that country against a person who was paying her interest on the day, and the letter that called it was signed by the bank president and not the old clerk, and it gave her to the 9th of July, 3 weeks, before the bank would move on the horses and the ground as security, which was to say before the 9th of July, 3 days after the condemnation hearing. The bank would take everything the railroad had not, and between the two of them, the road in front and the bank behind, there would be nothing left of her at all. She read the letter standing in her own kitchen, and set it on the table next to the oilcloth packet, and looked at the two of them side by side, the lie and the truth. The paper that was written by a man who thought no one would check, and the paper that would check it, and she did not sit down, because she had learned that when the news is very bad, the thing to do is stay on your feet and do the next chore, and the next chore was the horse. They came for Wade Coburn the same week. He would not swear to the moved line. The company had wanted a company man to testify at the hearing that the survey was regular and the crossing worthless, and Wade Coburn was the road's own teamster boss and bridge foreman, and his word on a crossing would have carried. And when he told the division superintendent, flatly, in front of Pryor, that he had run the true line himself in the rain with a government chain, and that the stake at the ford was 700 feet off, and he would swear to that and to nothing else, they took his crews and his stock and his trestle off him, and gave him a week's pay, and told him the road had no further use for a man who could not see the company's interest. He did not tell Esther for 2 days. When he did, at the ford in the evening, he said it the way he said everything, flat, looking at the water. They cut me loose, and she said, for the line, and he said for the line, and neither of them said the rest of it, which was that he had spent his last coin of usefulness to the road on her cause, and had nothing now to trade, no place inside the thing to work from, and had done it with his eyes open, and would do it again. She noticed the shelf, and this time she did not look away from it, but there was no time, and a called note and a coming hearing are not a season for the things on the shelf, and they both knew it, and left them there, folded, for later, if there was a later. What Pryor did with the horse was the cruelest thing in the whole business, because it used the horse's own mended trust against him, and it very nearly worked. On the night before the hearing, the 27th of June, a warm, still night, someone came up the lane in the dark and cut the wire of her round pen and the poles of her corral, and turned out every horse she owned, the 14 head and the gray, and scattered them down the valley toward the grade, and did it quietly, and did one thing more. They left, snagged on the cut wire, where a horse would have to have caught it, a torn piece of a company teamster's coat, and they left, near the grade camp where the loose horses, fetched up in the dark, a man down in the brush with a broken arm and a story, one of Pryor's men, who swore before witnesses at first light that the widow Ballard's gray killer stallion had come down in the night out of a broken corral and set upon him, and near killed him, the man killer loose again, just as the whole county had always known it would be. And would the commissioner not agree that a woman who could not keep a known killer horse penned was hardly a fit steward of a public crossing, and was a danger to the road's men besides, and ought to be relieved of both without further delay? She was up before light hunting horses, and she heard the story before she had them all in. Heard it from a grader who told it to her half in pity. The gray had savaged a man in the night, and the sheriff was spoken of, and Pryor was seeing to it, and she stood in the gray dawn with a lead rope in her hand, and the fear that had stood off at the edge of the firelight all June walked all the way in, and sat down in her chest, because this was the shape of ruin she could not outwork, a killer horse, and an injured man, and a torn coat, and her word against theirs. And she knew, none better, that the horse had not been out of her sight past midnight, that she had penned him herself, that the wire was cut from outside. But she knew, too, that knowing a thing and proving it are two countries, and that she was, as always, alone on the wrong side of the river between them. And then she found the gray. He had not scattered down the valley with the others. He had gone through the cut wire and come around the house, and was standing at the kitchen door in the dawn, dark with dew, waiting for her, the way a dog waits, the killer the county was building a gallows of words for. And she put her face against his neck in the wet dark, and stood there a moment, and let herself be afraid, all the way once. And then she was done with it, and she took him, and penned him, and mended the wire, and began, cold and clear again, to do the next chore, which was to save both their lives before the sun of the 28th went down. For she saw, standing there mending the cut wire in the dawn, the one thing about the frame that its makers had been too clever to notice: the wire was cut from the outside. A horse breaking out cuts nothing. He pushes, and breaks poles inward, and leaves hair and hide on the splinters. This wire was cut clean with a nipper. From the field side, the cut ends bright, and the poles were dropped from their sockets by a hand, not driven out by a body, and the torn coat was snagged on the cut so neatly, at hand height, that no plunging horse had put it there. She left it all exactly as it was. She did not mend it after all. She got the coil of her own new wire, the very wire she had bought in Stanford the morning of the notice, and she compared it. And it was not her wire that had been cut. Her wire was uncut on the reel, and she took her father's field glass and got down in the dew and read the ground the way she read the Ford. The boot tracks in the soft place by the cut, a company boot, a heel worn on the outside the particular way a teamster's heel wears, and one long drag where a man with a limp had favored a leg. And she thought of Pryor's teamster, the wire-bit man, the man who had ruined the horse, and she rose up out of the wet grass with the cold, clear thing burning in her now like a coal. Because she had them. She had them the way you have a thing when you have stopped being afraid of it and started reading it. They had built her a frame and left every nail showing. Because they had been sure. The way the man who laid the paint was sure that no one would ever get down in the grass and count. She was not, she found, quite as alone as the county had arranged for her to feel. The first crack that Deal the hay rancher had run out through the certainty had spread, quietly, the way water spreads under a floor, and in the days before the hearing people began to come to her, one at a time. At dusk, on some thin errand, and to say the true thing at the door before they left. Deal's wife brought a crock of butter she did not need to bring, and stood on the step and said her man had watched the widow ride that horse, and that she for one did not believe a woman who could gentle a killer like that had gone soft in the head, whatever Pryor said. An old freighter named Sorrells, who had crossed her father's ford for 30 years, rode up and told her, awkward, hat in hand, that he had hauled over that crossing in every stage of water, and that no honest survey ran the main line below the bar, and that he would say so to anyone. Though he hoped, he said going red, that it would not come to him having to say it to the company. For he hauled for the company still. She thanked them all, and fed the information into the cold, clear thing, and understood that a county's certainty is not one wall, but a great many small hands holding a wall up, and that the hands were beginning, one at a time, to tire. Wade came the night before the hearing, and they laid the case out on the plank table by lantern light, the plat and the patent and the field notes and the chain count she had run and he had witnessed, and they built it the way you build a load that has to ride a bad road, low and tied down, and every piece able to bear the shift of the others, so that if the lawyers knocked one prop out the rest would still stand. And Wade said the hard true thing, that it would not be enough. You've got the truth, he said, and the truth in that room tomorrow is a woman with no lawyer and a dead man's papers, against 2 company lawyers and a bot commissioner and an injured man and a killer horse. The truth doesn't win a room like that, Esther. You know it doesn't. Your father knew it. I know it, she said. So what do you mean to do? And she told him, and he sat back and looked at her a long while in the lantern light, this scarred, quiet man who had lost a boy to a map, and something moved over his face that was close to the thing she kept on her shelf, and he said at last, "That's a hell of a bet, to lose the room on purpose to win the ground." "It's the only table where I hold the cards," she said. "In that room, Dutcher deals. On the ground, my father deals, and he set the corner in granite, and the granite doesn't care whose coat is clean." And Wade Coburn, who had spent his life being dealt to by men with maps, put out his scarred hand across the plank table. Plain. The way men shake on a deal, and she took it, and they shook on it, on the losing of the room to win the ground, and that, a handshake over a losing hand played to win a truer one, was the nearest thing to a vow either of them ever spoke, and it held. The hearing on the 28th went against her, and she had known it would, and she let it, which is a hard thing to make people understand. She went into Dutcher's crowded hearing room with her plat and her patent and her father's field notes and her chain count, and she was not allowed to show the half of it. She had no lawyer, and Pryor had 2, and every time she began to lay the true line, the lawyers objected that she was not a qualified surveyor, and the objection was sustained. And when she said her father had run the line for the government, they said her father was dead and could not be cross-examined. And when she produced the field notes, they said a copy in a dead man's hand proved nothing. And the injured teamster told his story of the killer horse and the broken corral. And a second man swore to the torn coat. And Pryor rose in his good coat and said, softly, that he took no pleasure in it, that Mrs. Ballard had his sympathy, a woman alone, in reduced circumstances, perhaps not entirely. He let it hang. Perhaps not entirely herself, since her misfortune, and that the company only wished to pay her a fair price, and see her settled somewhere safer, away from a crossing and a horse that were plainly beyond her strength to manage. And the room murmured its agreement, and Harl Dutcher, comfortable, laced his fingers on his stomach and found that the condemnation should proceed. The taking confirmed, the horse to be dealt with as a public danger under the proper writ. The whole matter concluded, unless, he said it as a formality, a door he was sure was shut, unless the objecting party could show in some form the commission could receive, cause to reopen before the taking was filed of record, which filing, he said, glancing at Pryor, the company might make at its convenience. And here is the thing she did, that no one in the room expected, because they had all decided what kind of woman she was, and a person's decision about you is a kind of blindness in them you can walk straight through. She did not argue the finding. She stood up in the murmuring room, quiet, and she said, in her level voice that carried without rising, I'll show cause. Not with talk. The commissioner's right that I'm no surveyor and my father's dead, so I'll not ask the commission to take my word, nor a dead man's. I'll ask it to take the grounds. There is a government section corner on the bench above my Ford, set in granite in 1871, that no man in this room can move and no lawyer can object to, and there is a government chain, and there is arithmetic, which even a woman is allowed to do. I ask the commission to come to the ground, before it files, and count the chain from the corner to the stake, in front of the county, and if the stake stands where the road's own field notes say the line runs, I'll sign your paper and take your $90 and go. And if it does not, if the government's own corner and the government's own chain say the stake was moved, then I ask this commission what kind of taking it is that needs the line moved to reach the thing it takes. And the room was quiet, and Pryor's soft face did not change, but something behind it did, the way still water changes when a thing moves under it, and Harl Dutcher, who could not, in a room full of the county, refuse to let the ground be measured, without every man there wondering why, said that the commission would view the premises on the 3rd of July, and count the chain, and settle the thing on the ground, and adjourned, and Esther Ballard walked out through the county that had come to watch her lose, and did not lose, not yet, and did not win, and went home to the horse. There were 5 days between the hearing and the viewing, the 28th of June to the 3rd of July, and they were the worst days. The days when a person who has forced her enemy into the open must simply endure the time before the reckoning, while the enemy, who has money and men and no scruple, uses that time as he pleases. And Pryor used it. On the first night, someone tried to pull her father's pins from the chain line on the bench, and would have, except that Wade Coburn, who had no job now and nowhere he had to be, was lying up in the rocks by the section corner with a rifle across his knees, and no intention of firing it, and every intention of being seen not firing it. And the pins stayed. On the second day, the bank sent a man out to inventory the horses against the called note, and the man counted the gray and wrote Killer Stallion, condemned, value nil in his book, and Esther let him. On the third day, the sky and the mountains went the color of a bruise and stayed, and the old-timers along the creek looked north and said there was a deal of snow yet up high, and a warm, wet wind now on it, and that Willow Creek had not shown the county what it could do since the June of '75, when it took the first poleway the freighters ever threw across it, and 2 men with it. And on the third night, the rain began in the mountains again, warm and steady, and did not stop, and Willow Creek began, in the dark, to rise. It rose faster than the June rise, because there was more snow behind it, and more warmth on the snow, and by midnight of the third, the creek that talked over its stones was a brown roar in the dark that a person felt in the soles of the feet. And Esther stood at the peeled marker post with a lantern, and watched the water climb it past the high mark of the whole year, and keep climbing, and read in the climb, the way she read everything, that the ford was going under, that by the small hours no stranger would find a way across Willow Creek in 11 miles, and that somewhere down at the Narrows the company's cheap poleway was already gone or going, and she thought, that is their trouble, not mine, and turned to go up to the horse, and heard under the roar a thing that was not the water, a man's voice and mules, and the pop of a whip, and the particular splintering groan of a wagon, in a place a wagon should not be, coming from the ford below, in the dark, in the flood. It was the payroll, and the engineer, and the whole of the road's grant in the water at the wrong crossing, because of the very lie Pryor had built. This is how it had come to pass, and she pieced it together after, though she grasped enough of it that night in the first half-minute to know what she was looking at. The Territorial and Northern had a land grant that lapsed by law if the road did not have its line built and inspected to the Willow Creek crossing by the 4th of July, and the government's inspectors had come and were waiting at the junction beyond the creek, and the road's chief locating engineer, a plain, honest, overworked man named Ezra Finch, had to be at the junction by dawn with the surveyed profile and the payroll for the graders, or the grant was gone and the road with it, and the poleway at the Narrows had washed out at dark, and the only crossing on Willow Creek was Esther Ballard's condemned ford. And Pryor, who ran the right-of-way, had told Finch there was a crossing at the ford, a staked crossing, the company's own staked crossing, and had sent them to it in the dark, to the stake, below the bar, over the soft cut, to the lie. And the lie, which had been built to steal a ford on paper, had now, in the flood, put a wagon and 4 mules and the payroll and the chief engineer of the railroad into the one piece of Willow Creek that would drown them. Because the man who moved the stake had never once, in all his cleverness, gotten down in the water and learned where the bottom was. She came down the bank with the lantern and saw it whole in the swinging light, the heavy wagon canted over with its off wheels already down in the soft cut below the bar, water piling brown against the upstream box and beginning to lift it. The 4 mules bunched and screaming and refusing, up to their bellies and lunging back from the deep, and Finch, standing up on the seat white, faced with a strong box roped to the boards, and a leather case of papers held over his head, and 2 company men on the bank with lanterns, doing the one thing men do at such a moment, which is shout advice at the water, and among them, on a dry horse well back from the edge, in his good coat, not shouting, only watching, Aldous Pryor, who had ridden out not to save the crossing but to witness it fail, to see the road's payroll and its grant go down at the Widow's Ford, so that by morning the story would be that the squatter woman's crossing had drowned the railroad, and the emergency taking would right itself, and her ruin be complete and profitable. He was not a man who did his own drowning. He only arranged the water and came to watch. And there was Wade Coburn, off his horse, out on the bar to his thighs in the flood with a rope, trying to get a line to the wagon and being beaten back. And he saw her lantern and roared over the water the only thing that mattered. which was that the mules would not face it and the wagon was going, and Finch could not swim, and there was no time, none. The box was lifting, and Esther Ballard stood 1/2 second on the bank of the creek her father had taught her to read, and did the last sum of that long summer, and it came out, the way the sum had come out at the auction rail. Clean and against all the arithmetic anyone else could see. No mule would face that water because a mule is too sensible to face that water. No company team would take the soft cut because the soft cut was death. But 11 paces upstream, above the bar, on the true line, on the sound rock crossing her father had graveled, and she had graveled after him. Where the road's own field notes said the line ran, and the moved stake said it did not, there was a bottom a horse could hold, a line that bent upstream around the drowned boulder her father had named the Deacon. A line no eye could see, and no stranger could find, and no mule would trust. A line you had to know. And she knew it, and she had, penned in the barn behind her, dry and mended and hers, the one horse in the whole of the Judith bold enough and honest enough and mended enough to be asked to swim a flood in the dark on the word of a hand he had learned, at last, to trust. She did not saddle him. There was no time, and a saddle is a thing to drown in, and she went up the bank running and into the barn, and put the plain warmed snaffle on him, with hands that did not shake because she would not let them. And she took him out into the roar bareback, with a coil of Wade's spare rope over her shoulder, and the gray came down the bank into the lantern light, and saw the flood, and threw his head up. Once, the old flinch, the whole history of fear in him rising up at the edge of the worst water he had ever seen. And she put her hand flat on his neck and talked, low and level, the price of oats and the state of the road, the river of quiet words with no edges on them, and told him what she had told him every dawn all June, that no one would raise a hand to his mouth again, that she was asking and not making, that he could. And the gray dropped his head and licked and chewed at the edge of a flood that was drowning a railroad. Because a bold, honest thing that has been read instead of broken will, when it is finally asked instead of forced, give you the whole of its heart. And he gathered himself under her and walked, then plunged out onto the true line, into the dark water, upstream around the Deacon, swimming when the bottom fell away, driving, honest, holding the line she called into his ear over the roar, and no man on either bank breathed. She reached the wagon from above, on the sound side, where the water ran deep but true, and she got Wade's rope to Finch, and got Finch off the lifting box and belly, down over the grazed loins behind her, with the leather case of the road's papers lashed to her own back. And she could not take the strong box, and the man both, and she took the man. And Finch, to his lasting credit, white and soaked and clutching, said the only wise thing anyone said that night, which was, leave the money, save the profile, meaning the surveyed papers were the grant and the coin was only coin, and she had already done it, and she turned the gray downstream and across on the true line, the Deacon on her right hand where it had always been. The horse swimming strong and straight under a double load in water that had turned back 4 mules, and brought the chief engineer of the Territorial and Northern out of Willow Creek, and up the far bank into the lantern light on the county side, alive, with the road's grant dry against her spine, and then, because the mules were still in the cut and would drown where they stood, she put the gray back into the flood a second time, and a third, and snubbed a line from the wagon tongue to the horn of Wade's saddle, and to the gray's chest, and the 2 horses together, hers swimming and Wade's hauling on the bar, dragged the wagon back off the soft cut and up onto the true line and out, mules and payroll and all, so that the road lost nothing that night, not a man, not a mule, not a dollar, not the grant, and owed the whole of it, every splinter and coin of it, to a condemned Ford and a killer horse, and a woman a soft-handed man had spent a summer teaching the county to call worthless. Aldous Pryor was gone from the bank before she brought the wagon out. No one saw him go. A man who arranges water and comes to watch it drown people does not stay to be seen when the people climb out instead, and he rode back to Stanford in the dark to be, by the arithmetic he trusted, the calm authority in a clean coat when the county woke, and to file, first thing, before anyone could count anything, the emergency taking. For the whole of his machine still turned on, getting the paper filed of record before the ground could be measured. He did not yet know what had happened on the bank. He did not know that the chief engineer of the road was alive, and shaking under a horse blanket in the widow's kitchen, drinking her coffee, reading, by the lantern, the copy of his own field notes that her father had kept in oilcloth for a dead man's honesty, and comparing them, line by line, in front of Wade Coburn and Ezra Finch's own 2 eyes, with the fresh white stake that stood 726 feet off the line his own hand had run. A man can lie to a commissioner. It is very hard to lie to the engineer whose notes you forged, in his own hand, while he is holding them, 4 hours after a woman he did not know pulled him out of a river to save the paper the notes are written on. The viewing of the premises was set for the 3rd of July, and the flood had come the night of the 3rd, and so it happened that the county came out on the morning of the 4th, Independence Day, and she never afterward heard a firecracker or saw a flag run up, but she thought of that morning, the whole county, in wagons and horseback, come to see the widow lose her ford to the railroad on the nation's birthday, and found instead the creek gone down to a bright brown swirl, and the ground steaming in the sun, and a chief engineer of the Territorial and Northern standing on the bench above the ford beside Wade Coburn and beside Esther Ballard, and the granite section corner her father set in '71. And a brass gunter's chain laid out in the wet grass, and Commissioner Harold Dutcher arrived comfortable and expecting a formality, being told by the road's own engineer, in front of 200 witnesses on Independence morning, that the company withdrew its objection to the objection, and that Mr. Finch would be obliged if the commission would now do the thing the widow had asked for, and count the chain. And they counted the chain. Ezra Finch himself took the head of it, and Wade Coburn drove the pins, and Esther Ballard called the count in her level voice that carried without rising, chain, and mark, the government's own measure walking down the bench from the government's own corner in front of the whole county in the clean morning light, and every plain man and woman there who had ever dragged a chain or paced a line, or read a paper with a seal on it, followed the arithmetic a link at a time. Because arithmetic on the ground in the sun is a thing a plain person can see, and cannot be objected out of the record by a lawyer, and does not care who is a widow and who is a company. And the chain ran to the Sound Rock, crossing above the bar, on the true line, exactly where the road's own field notes said. And it missed the deeded ford clean, and it fetched up 726 feet, 11 chains, and Finch called it aloud, 11 chains, from the fresh white stake Pryor's men had driven at the head of her crossing. A stake whose cedar butt, when Wade Coburn pulled it up out of the ground and held it high over his head for the county to see, was bright and unweathered, and sharp cut. The wood of a thing set a fortnight ago, not the gray-checked wood of a stake that had stood a year in the ground it claimed the survey had put it in. And the county, that had come to watch her lose, stood in the wet grass on the morning of the 4th of July, and counted the chain, and looked at the bright butt of the moved stake, and went, all together. The particular silence of a great many people arriving at the same time at a thing they cannot any longer unsee. It came apart quickly after that, the way a machine comes apart when one true thing is put in the gears of it. Finch's field notes, in his own hand, against the forged copy in the company's file, and Finch swore the file was forged. For a man knows his own hand, and knows where he did not write a bend. The bright butt of the moved stake. The boot tracks in the dew by the cut wire on the round pen, a teamster's heel worn on the outside, a favored leg that Esther had left untouched, and now walked the commissioner and the county to and showed, beside the uncut coil of her own new wire, so that the frame of the killer horse fell in the same hour as the fraud of the moved line, both of them the work of the same cold, patient hand, Pryor's wire-bit teamster, who was found by afternoon to have left the country on the morning train and to have taken, the ticket agent said, a ticket bought for him by Mr. Pryor. And Aldous Pryor, who had filed his emergency taking first thing in the clean morning and gone to his breakfast sure of it, was still eating it when the county's temper came for him, and the surveyed line was ordered rerun under the government's man, and the taking was set aside, and the resale of the surplus rock crossing that was to have made his fortune was found to have been arranged. In writing, with Commissioner Harl Dutcher named silently in the Prophet, 3 weeks before the condemnation he had presided over was ever heard, and that piece of paper, when it was found, was the end of both of them. For a man may move a stake in the field where he thinks no one will count, but he ought never to put his greed in writing where a clerk can keep a copy. And this is the second great truth of that whole summer, under the first, that the honest keep copies, and in the long run the copies win. The road paid her. Not the $90, that paper was ash, but a fair price. Finch's price, the engineer's own reckoning of what a sound crossing is worth to a railroad that has to be over the water by a date. For a voluntary easement across the rock crossing on the bench, clear of her deeded ford, which is where any honest survey would have put the line in the first place, and where it went in the end, and the sum of it, when Finch named it, and the roads division office confirmed it under the fresh eye of a superintendent who wanted no more of Pryor's kind of arithmetic in his territory, was a little over $1,100, which paid the $400 note in full at the Stanford Bank, with the old man Josiah Vane, the banker, shaking her hand across the counter and saying he had never doubted her paper, which was a lie, and a kind one, and she let him have it. And the road, needing a crossing tender and a freight team on Willow Creek, where the grade met the water. And having watched a certain gray stallion do in one flooded night what the whole company's stock could not, hired her, the deserted widow woman, as its contract crossing tender at the ford, at a wage, with the gray on the company's books, at a valuation of $250, listed by name, ransom, saddle stallion, sound and gentle, will take anyone anywhere, which was the auctioneer's old joke, set down at last as the plain truth it had always secretly been. She drove the gray up the main street of Stanford that fall, hitched single to a light wagon, sound and willing and shining, past the freight dock where the men had laughed, past Boone the teamster, past the depot wall where the notice had hung, and she did not look at any of them. The same as she had not looked at any of them the morning of the notice, and the not looking meant a different thing now, and every man on the dock knew exactly what it meant, and not one of them laughed. The horse the county had condemned to the killers for the price of his hide walked down the middle of the town that had condemned him with his ears working and his eye quiet, driven on a loose rein by a woman in a faded blue dress and a stained apron, and the men who had built a gallows of words for him took their hats off, some of them, not to her, they would not have known how, but to the horse, which was their way of taking it off to her, without having to know how, and she let them, and drove on, and did not look. And that was the whole of the vindication she ever took in public, and it was enough. She was not a woman who needed the county to say it. She only needed the county to have to know it. And now it did. And would, every time a proud man led a mare up her draw for the next 13 years, and had to do the hard sum of what he had once been sure he could see. What they call worthless, her father used to say, and she had not understood him when she was a girl dragging his chain, is most often only a thing they have not yet learned to see. He had said it about a played-out claim that ran good water, and about a plain daughter, and about a crossing nobody thought was work. And she had carried the sentence around for 30 years, the way you carry a key to a lock you have not found yet. And that summer she had found the lock, and it fit. The horse was worth $250 and had cost $3. And the difference was only that she had looked at his mouth when the county looked at his temper. The Ford was worth a railroad and had been called worth 90, and the difference was only that she had counted the chain when the county read the paint. And she herself was worth, well, that was a longer sum, and she was still doing it, but she had a better opinion of the figure now than she had had on the morning of the notice. And she had learned that the opinion of the county was not a term in the sum at all, and never had been, and that its absence from the arithmetic was not a loss but the whole of the freedom. Wade Coburn came back to work on the road that winter for the new superintendent on his own terms, boss of the crossing and the trestle both, and he had reason to be at Willow Creek most days, and reasons to stay past the reason, and the two of them let the thing on the shelf come down slowly, over that winter and the next, the way you gentle a thing that has been hurt, an ounce at a time with no hand raised, asking and not making. And I will not tell you more of it than that, because it was theirs, and they kept it quiet, and this is not that kind of story, and never was. I will only tell you that on a bright cold morning the second winter, the old sorrel died in the pasture of nothing but age, the horse that had come home without a man, and Esther buried it herself on the bench above the Ford near the section corner, and stood over it a while with her hat in her hands, and what she felt was not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but the quiet of a long sum. Finally coming out even, an account closed, a man let go at last to wherever he had gone, with no hard feeling kept, and none owed. And then she walked back down to the barn, where the gray put his head over the door to meet her, and to where a scarred, quiet man was mending harness by the stove, and looked up when she came in, and she found that the empty saddle did not ache any longer, that the wound the town had named her by had healed clean, not because a man had come to fill the place, but because she had herself filled it, with work and with reading, and with the one true thing she had proved to the whole of the Judith on a flooded night, which was that she had never once, in all of it, been the thing they said. She kept the Ford the rest of her life, and charged no toll the way her father had, because a crossing is a thing put in the ground for everyone, and she kept the brass chain oiled and hanging by the door, and taught a good many children up and down the Judith to drag it and call the count, and told them, every one, the 2 sentences her father had told her, that the land was here before the paint, and that you count the chain and not the stake. And she kept, nailed over the gray's stall door, where she could see it from the yard, the 3 worn silver dollars she had paid for him, drilled and wired to the wood side by side, bright, so that every proud man who ever led a mare up her draw had to look at $3 and a great gentle horse, and do, whether he wanted to or not, the hard sum, and when the children asked her why she kept $3 nailed to a barn, she would say only that they were the best money she ever spent, and that they had bought her a horse the county could not see, and that a thing the county cannot see, if you have the patience to read it instead of break it, and the nerve to count the chain instead of the paint, and the willingness to put your hand where nobody wants to put a hand, is most often not worthless at all, but the one diamond in the whole of the dust, waiting in a killing pen, or a condemned Ford, or a written-off woman, for the one person left in the county who has not yet learned to call it worthless. And that, she would say, is the end of it, and it is time you were home before dark. Mind the Ford, and count the chain, and do not trust the paint. And she would send them up the true line in the last of the light, and stand at the door with the horse, and watch them go,